So what do we do in the face of this? What responses, emotional and practical? I mean, how does this existential threat affect you? How does it affect the way you wish to live your life? So Stephen Jenkinson talks about our death-phobic culture. My understanding is that our dying times are an opportunity to really live well if we pay attention to how precious life is. That we come to peace when we understand that life is far bigger than any of us as individuals. We can understand our role in the service of life as we join a line of worthy ancestors, those that went before us, and we make our lives about honouring and protecting those that come after us. In indigenous cultures, they talk about protecting the next 7 generations. In the age of ecological meltdown, when our children's future is currently set to an unimaginable catastrophe, it's our job to really allow ourselves to feel the grief and then ask how we intend to act. And I think it's a big thing to decide to face the grief of this and not turn away from it. It's a courageous thing to do in itself. This is a big shift in our consciousness. It's one that moves away from the very deeply embedded narcissistic culture of consumerism that I'm sure we're all embedded in, where we ask, what do I need? How can I feel better? How do I hang on to privilege for myself and my family? It moves towards accepting that this is a time of grief, but that we can still appreciate beauty. We can still keep ourselves in good shape for the task required of us. It asks us to step into service and be willing to do the things that might just make a difference. It asks us to make sacrifices. This is a big emotional shift, and actually, I think it's really liberating. So we need a new approach in the face of this failure. We need the world's governments to introduce a World War II style mobilisation. The American economy was transformed in a matter of a few months to deal with existential threat. I'm not going to go into details, but the kinds of things it would involve are reducing carbon emissions, of course, reducing demand, a massive investment in safe ways of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, transport, regenerative agriculture, restoring ecosystems. It's all technologically and economically possible and in a short space of time. Solutions are there, right? The absolute key issue is, how do you create enough political pressure? It's up to us to create that political will, and there are tried and tested techniques for doing that. So we're talking about the need for civil disobedience that escalates into a rebellion and uprising. The good news is it doesn't actually need that many people, which gives everyone in this room, everyone who hears this talk, an immense opportunity to do something amazing. We're talking about needing a few hundred people, not 2 million people to go on a march, right? Would you be one of those few hundred people? So when people hear something frightening, the conventional wisdom is that they will get paralysed and turn away from the subject, which is why, as I said earlier, climate change has been based on lying, talking about climate change in the past, because we didn't want people to turn away, we wanted them to do something. So that's the process of being a bystander. Something's causing you fear, so find a way to get rid of facing the fear. However, a small percentage of people are what are known as upstanders. And so the aim of this talk is to try and find upstanders, and you can choose to be an upstander. And our approach in Rising Up is based on the belief that some smaller group of upstanding people will not only be willing to act, but will be willing to do what it takes. So let's talk a little bit about ethics. You know, if you do a bad thing, if you plan a terrible thing, you get punished, right? If you punch someone in the face, you'll get a fine. If you plan to blow up a building, you'll go to prison. There's a progression to wrongdoing. Again, Nazi Germany, use of toxic gas to kill its Jewish population was horrendous. And those Nazis that survived the war faced the Nuremberg trials and they went to prison. But what if they planned to gas cities across the world? Their crime would have been even worse. Or suppose they wanted to gas an entire country or even the whole world. The reality is that the levels of CO2 being pumped into our atmosphere based on policies that governments are behind, is planned, it's willful, and it will kill millions of people. So in Rising Up, we're saying that climate change is not a political issue. It's an issue of morality. What's happening is bad, it's evil, and it has to be stopped. And that when a government does something that is horrendously immoral, it has to be challenged. And that's regardless of your political choice. There's a political spectrum. It doesn't matter where you lie on that. We probably understand the left wing and the idea of rebellion on the left wing. But political theorists across the political spectrum agree that rebellion is justified once the establishment fails. John Locke is a liberal. He termed what political philosophers call the right of revolution, when a government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens, as in the case of climate change, the people have the right to rebel. Thomas Hobbes is a conservative. He spoke about the social contract, where the state derives and loses its authority based on its willingness and ability to maintain order and security for its people. The Second Amendment in the US is also based in this principle. So we're asking people to act as if the information presented tonight is real and take appropriate responses. Now, the conventional approach to tackling issues involves awareness raising, leafleting, lobbying, send emails to your MP, build a collective demand, go on a march, get a petition together. These approaches are appropriate for relatively small political issues like an unwanted housing development and for the early stages of raising an alarm about a specific issue, but they are not appropriate for issues that are existential and urgent. I'm not saying they shouldn't happen at all, but if that's the plan, it's not going to work. There are powerful political and economic interests involved that stop necessary change from happening. So in these cases, an appropriate response requires high-stake, disruptive civil disobedience and non-violent sacrificial action. And just to talk about it in some summary, the actions have to be disruptive. They have to disrupt major cities, which gets the attention of political decision makers. You've got lots of examples of that in the past. In the recent past, a really good example is how the gay rights movement got the attention of everybody to change the way that AIDS was being researched and dealt with. And what they did was super disruptive. And basically, when you're disruptive, people say, well, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't like how you're doing it. And the point is they're talking about it. So the disruption is just unfortunate. It needs to be sacrificial. We've had people going on hunger strike in our actions. And the willingness to go to jail is what makes observers sympathetic. So much in humanity is about emotion, right? It's not about what you say, how you persuade people with arguments. It's about how people feel. And when they can see how serious you are about a cause, then it wakes people up. You can use a process of backfiring. Opponents tend to respond to direct action with some form of repression, arresting people and so on, and it shows them in a bad light to observers who are therefore more likely to join in. But it's also respectful. Opponents are treated with respect. It's absolutely non-violent. Non-violence is morally and materially functional. In fact, you're not as successful if you use violence. There's lots of data on that. So non-violent civil disobedience has a strong grounding in history. You know of these people, the obvious ones, Luther King, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. In the bottom corner there's James Hansen. He's the preeminent grandfather of climate science, right? He's been arrested in honour of the cause, and there's a polar bear also getting arrested, and Caroline Lucas at a fracking site. Its efficacy is well known. What I find is that people like it in the past, but they don't like it so much in the present. So the Overton Window, you may have heard of, is a phrase referring to what's seen as normal and acceptable part of the mainstream of public discussion of issues. The debate in the popular press about climate change, but thank God about hearing about the BBC changing their minds around this stuff, but it tends to be limited to the fact that it will be a substantial cost, not talking about it being the utter catastrophe that it's going to be. And it doesn't reflect reality. So disruptive and unexpected behaviour can change the Overton Window. Trump and Brexit have managed to move the Overton Window to a place where upfront racism becomes normalised, whereas a few years ago we couldn't have imagined an American president caging children and talking about banning Muslims. So we want the reality of the ecological threat to be a mainstream discussion, for people to know how bad a state we are leaving the world in for our children. So it's not for future generations, which can sound some time away, not so imminent and somehow a bit unreal. The first step of the rebellion is to shift this Overton window. It'll probably require something like 50 to 100 people to go to jail and of order 1,000 arrests. In fact, we've been told by a major publication 50 people in jail will get us a front cover. Now, it turns out beyond that you only need between 1% and 3% of a population to be mobilised to bring about massive social change or the fall of a regime. This is data from Erica Chenoweth. It's only 2 million people in the UK. So the Egyptian revolution had only 1 million people in Tahrir Square, despite the fact there were 20 million people living in the Greater Cairo area, and the country has a population of around 90 million. So there isn't a need for the people to rise up, it's just for some of us. And some of us have got to lead the edge, we've got to lead the way. We don't know, of course, the exact figures, but we can look to historical examples. So Martin Luther King and the American Civil Rights Movement didn't bring about any change, particularly through using conventional approaches. From the mid-50s, they took to direct action campaigns, and that brought about significant changes. It involved several hundred people going to prison and several thousand arrests, so it gives us a benchmark. These are the Freedom Riders. They were black and white people that went on buses in the southern parts of the USA to break the bus station segregation policy. It started with just 25 students. So just double who's in this room, right? And it ended with around 300 people in prison by the end of the summer, and it caused a fundamental change in policy. If it takes 300 people in jail in America, what does it take in the UK? So we think we probably need about 2 million people in active support. So lots of people can be behind the scenes fundraising, supporting. Not everybody has to go to jail, but that is useful. It might be 5,000 people willing to do civil disobedience, or say 500 people in jail. What we do know is the more high stake the action is, the fewer people are needed to create the desired change. And to begin is the most important next step. So we talked in the beginning of this talk about dire future prospects. Is there any hope? Is it even worth trying? Well, yes, we've shown you that there are solutions. There is something worth trying. It's ambitious, but it is at least feasible. But in some ways, the question's wrong, and it's become a bit of a habit in Western countries. There's two influential schools in the history of ethics. Utilitarianism, which is where you do something wanting an outcome. And there's nothing wrong with that, but to an extent, it's better to look at virtue ethics, which asks us what makes me a good human being? What does it mean to live a good life in these times? And in this tradition, it's practical wisdom. It's our heart that leads and precedes the actions and decisions. So it's always worth doing something if it's morally good and the right thing to do, no matter how successful we'll be. And that's where we're at in Rising Up with this. This is what we're about. And just to quote Dr. Kate Marvel again, courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. We're talking about traditional values here, orientated towards service to community, duty, responsibility, honour, and a desire to be a worthy ancestor. In fully understanding that we'll die one day, it could be soon, wishing to fully live a meaningful life. And in facing the risk of life on earth dying, to step forwards and be willing to offer our service to something bigger than ourselves, to life itself. For some, this is a basic orientation of their spiritual expression, the part of ourselves that understands what's sacred. So I'm asking you to take a minute to ask yourself, given what I've just heard, what does it mean for me to be a good human? What does it mean to die without regrets? Will you be able to look your grandchildren in the eye and say you did what you could?